Let's look at the bound or welt pocket sample. I want to preface this video to say this is one technique to sew one type of welt pocket. There are a multitude of techniques available for sewing a variety of welt pockets, but we'll be working on one technique to make a double welt pocket specifically. For this sample, I am using the bound/welt pocket garment pattern, one piece cut from muslin. The bound/welt pocket garment interfacing pattern, one piece cut from fusible interfacing. The double welt pattern, two pieces cut from contrast fabric, and two pieces cut from fusible interfacing. And the bound/welt pocket bag pattern, one piece cut from contrast fabric. To begin, for our prep work, I'll be putting my interfacing into place. I'm going to start with the bound/welt pocket garment pattern. And I used my transfer paper, chalk side up, and my serrated tracing wheel to copy the four corners of this rectangle that is marked on the pattern. So on the wrong side of my muslin, you can see I faintly copied where that rectangle goes, because on this wrong side of my fabric, I'm going to take the bound/welt pocket garment interfacing, this big piece of interfacing, and I'm going to affix that, fuse that to the wrong side of my fabric. I'm going to go ahead and fuse that, and I'll be right back. All right, I have fused my interfacing to the back. Remember, if you were making an actual garment, you wouldn't be working with just a rectangle of fabric. It would be your actual garment piece. Maybe it's a skirt piece or a pant piece or something like that. This rectangle is just to represent your garment, whatever that happens to be. So, as I mentioned before, it's not important that we get all this information in this rectangle, because we just need to know where to position the interfacing so that it covers those four corners. Now that it's been covered with interfacing, I have to find that rectangle again. I'm going to copy this rectangle to the right side of my fabric, because it'll make positioning my welts a little bit easier in the future. For the sake of the sample, I'll use my transfer paper chalk side down, slide that in between my pattern, which is still pinned, to my fabric, and use my serrated tracing wheel to copy the four corners of this rectangle. If I were working on an actual garment, I would test to make sure that this chalk from my transfer paper would launder away, wash away from my fabric, or I would use a friction pen. Now that I've got the four corners of that rectangle on the right side of my sample, I can remove my pattern. And now I will switch to my friction pen so I can clearly define those four corners that I just copied from my pattern. You don't have to use transfer paper. You can just take measurements off of the pattern and copy those marks and those measurements directly onto your fabric. There's my rectangle. I'm going to go ahead and mark the internal lines to this rectangle. There's a line going down the center horizontally. This should be a 1/2 inch tall rectangle, so I'm going to mark a horizontal line down its middle. That's a 1/4 of an inch. And then I'm going to mark these little triangles on the sides. It's not important how wide those triangles are, just so long as they're there. All right. I'm done with this pattern. I'm going to set that aside. And I'm done with prep work for this. I'm going to set this aside, make sure I don't iron it again because I don't want to lose my marks. Moving on to the double welt pattern pieces. 2 rectangles cut out of contrast fabric. I'm going to put those wrong sides up and take my interfacing pieces with the nibby rough side down. Again, fusible, rough side, adhesive side down. I'll take these to the iron, press my interfacing into place, and if I need to, I'll trim any excess interfacing away from the edges. All right, my 2 welts are prepared. I've got my fusible interfacing fused to the back, to the wrong side, and I trimmed away some of the excess bits and pieces of the interfacing that were hanging off of there. So those are prepped and ready to go. So let's go ahead and start installing our welts to our garment or our sample garment. So that same rectangle that we traced from the pattern, I'm going to take one of my welts with the right side of the fabric facing down. So this would be the right side of my garment. The wrong side has the interfacing on it. Right side of my garment, right side of my welt, right sides together. And I want to align one of the long edges of my welt to this center line that I marked on my pattern. Doesn't have to be perfect, because if this welt isn't cut perfectly straight, it won't match a perfectly straight line. But get as close as possible. And I'm going to do my best to straddle the excess fabric on either side. So avoid placing your welt like this. We want to have some excess fabric for the welt hanging off of both sides. Don't place it like this. We want to center it as best we can to that rectangle that we marked. So we have extra fabric on either side. I'm going to pin this in place. Through all the layers. Now, the line that I just covered up, this edge of my rectangle, I need to mark that on my welt because I'm going to have to sew along that line. Recall that this rectangle is 1/2 inch wide. So each one of these welts being placed along the center line, we're going to stitch 1/4 inch away from that center line. So 2 squares. So with this lined up as it is, I should be able to measure 1/4 inch away from that center line and mark the edge of that rectangle onto my welt fabric. I highly recommend using a friction pen for this. Chalk will be a little bit more difficult to see, but here is that 1/4 inch line making up the rest of that rectangle. So I'm essentially copying this line of the rectangle onto my welt fabric. So I know where I should be stitching, but I don't know where I need to start and stop stitching. I don't want to stitch the entire length of my welt. I want to make sure I keep my stitches within the confines of this rectangle. So from this edge, following the side of the rectangle that I have copied from the pattern, I'm just going to make a little mark here so I know where to put my needle. Where these 2 lines intersect is where I'm going to start sewing. And over here on the other side of this rectangle, I'm going to put another little mark on my welt so I know where to stop sewing. So I'm going to start where these lines intersect, my needle down, back tack at the beginning, stitch along this line, and make sure my needle finishes here and back tack at the end. I'm going to go ahead and pin my other welt in place so that they're both ready to go when I get to the machine. And you'll see how I do this one more time. Here's my other welt, right sides to the right side of my garment, right sides together. Again, I want to align this to the center line that's drawn on that rectangle So now we're butting up both of the welts. They're both covering the garment pattern. I'm going to align that, pin it in place. Make sure to pin through all the layers. Actually, I'm going to put my pins this way so the heads of the pins don't get in the way. Okay. Now, yet again, I need to copy this line from my rectangle onto here. But I already know where this line is, and I know how wide the rectangle needs to be. It's 1/2 inch. So as long as I have this guideline, I can measure 1/2 inch away from it. Half an inch is 4 of the squares on my ruler. So there's the bottom edge of my rectangle. Here's the top edge of my rectangle. And again, I need to make sure I start and end where that original rectangle was marked. I know where it starts because I've cross-marked it on this welt. So I'm just going to copy that up here onto my top welt. No other cross mark, so I know where to begin sewing. Make sure to keep, again, using a clear ruler helps because you can make sure all your lines are squared up to all the squares on your ruler. So again, when I go to sew, I'm going to put my needle down here, back tack at the beginning, stitch all the way across, make sure my needle stops, and then back tack at the end. Make sure my needle stops right there. This is a good practice in machine control. You do not want to overshoot any of these points because your welt pocket will not be square when it's finished. I'm going to head to the sewing machine and I'm going to go ahead and sew these 2 welts in place. Over at my sewing machine, first thing I want to do is make sure I'm stitching at a number 1 stitch. So I'm going to change to a number 1 stitch. The reason we switch to a number 1 stitch is we need a lot of reinforcement in these corners that I'm getting ready to sew, and a number 1 stitch is going to be much more secure than a number 2 stitch, but because we're stitching on a number 1, we need to be absolutely sure we're stitching in the correct place and stopping in the correct place because we don't want to have to pick those stitches out because they're very tiny. I'm going to start here at my little cross mark on one of my welts. Lower my needle into place, 2 stitches forward. I'll do 3 stitches forward. 2 or 3 stitches is fine. 2 or 3 stitches back. I want to make sure that I get right into that corner that I marked. And then I will stitch along this line that I marked. As I approach my other cross mark down here, I want to make sure that my needle stops directly in that cross mark. Remember, you can always walk stitches, and as you walk the stitches, you can slightly position the fabric into place, and then I will back tack about 2 or 3 stitches, and then I'll just come forward 2 or 3 stitches. Make sure my take-up lever is up, lift my presser foot, remove my work, and trim my threads. So that's 1 line of stitching done. Make sure these little ends are free and loose. You can always check underneath to see if you got close to your original marks. That's pretty good. Let me sew the other one again, starting where one of my cross marks are. Back tack at the beginning, number 1 stitch. Stitch along the line. Keep it nice and straight. Keep your stitches straight and parallel. I'm using the edge of my presser foot as a guide to keep my stitches straight to the other line of stitching I just finished. I think my welt fabric may have shifted a little bit. My cross marks look a little bit off, so I'm going to do my best to walk my stitches and eyeball placing my needle parallel to where I last left off. And back tack. And a few stitches forward. Make sure my take-up lever is up. Lift my presser foot, remove my work, and trim my threads. Okay, 2 lines of stitching done. Let's head back to the production table for the next step. So I've got my stitching complete. I should have the sides of my welts still loose. Do not stitch all the way across or this will not work. Now comes the tricky, scary part. When you make a welt pocket, you have to cut into your fabric, into your garment. So I'm actually going to cut into my muslin. The welts I don't need to worry about. Those are perfectly fine, but I need to cut into the muslin underneath. I'm going to lift up the welt pocket fabric so that I can see the line work I left underneath. This line down the center and these little triangles that I drew earlier that I copied off of the pattern. That's what I want to be able to see. I'm just going to hold this fabric back. You do not have to pin this. You can do this by hand. I'm just pinning this in out of my way so you can clearly see what I'm getting ready to do. Again, you do not have to pin yours. I'm just pinning mine out of the way so you can see for the demo. But you just want to get that welt pocket fabric out of the way. Just hold it out of the way with your fingers. I'm going to fold my sample. So I'm just folding this in half. Grab my scissors and snip along that center line. So I've just placed a hole in my muslin as well as the interfacing on the back. Now I just need to cut along these lines. I'm going to snip along this horizontal line until I get to the point of this triangle and stop. I'm going to cut the opposite direction along the center of this line till I get to the point of the triangle and stop. At this point, I need to cut along the edges of this triangle. From where I left off here, I'm going to snip up into this corner, down into that corner, up into this corner, and down into that corner. And you can do that with your regular scissors, but they're very small cuts. They're very delicate. You have to be very careful when you make these cuts. So I'm going to switch scissors. Again, you can use your regular scissors. I'm going to switch to a smaller set of embroidery scissors. So I have a little bit more dexterity in the corners. And I'm going to zoom way in so you can see exactly where I'm cutting, because we don't want to cut too far, but it's important that we cut far enough or else our welt pocket won't show properly. This is where I left off with my cutting right here. I'm going to cut into my stitching, well, not through it, but towards my stitching. I want to clip my muslin fabric as close to that stitch as I possibly can get without cutting through it. See if I can even get closer. So sliding my scissors into my muslin fabric, clipping into that corner as close as I can get without clipping through that stitching. Of course, that was off camera. but I clipped as far as I could until I got to that stitching. I'll go down to this corner. I can slightly see my stitching right there. Clip as far as I can towards that stitching without clipping through it. Same thing in the opposite corners, to the stitching as close as possible without snipping through the stitching. Okay. So now I've got this slit down the center and all 4 little slits going into each of the corners towards my stitching. I'm going to remove my pins just so that can lay flat. Now we're going to head to the iron and start getting this prepped for creating our welts. Okay, we're getting ready to press a lot of tiny 1/4 inch seam allowances and little corners and triangles and whatnot. So you are absolutely going to want to utilize the tailor's point so that we can isolate those tiny seam allowances and give us a little bit more dexterity with the ironing board. Now remember, this is the right side of my garment. So I've got all this extra gunk hanging out on the outside of my garment. No one wants to see that. So we're going to take our welts and we're actually going to push them to the inside or the wrong side of the garment. I'm going to start with my bottom welt here. I'm going to take the welt fabric and push it through the hole that I just cut out of my muslin. I'm just pushing all the fabric through to the wrong side of the garment. So now you can see the right side of my welt fabric. And if I flip this over, you'll see now I've got my welt hanging out on the wrong side of my garment. By default, all of my seam allowances, my garment fabric, and my welt fabric are pushing away from my welt, which is what I want. I'm going to make sure that I hold my welt fabric pretty taut, and I am going to place this on my tailor's board so I can isolate just this little 1/4 inch seam allowance. And I'm going to press this, again, holding the fabric taut. See how I'm pushing down on both sides to make sure I don't get any puckers while I'm pressing this seam allowance. Nice and flat. And you should have a nice flat finish on the front. We shouldn't see the muslin fabric rolling up on itself if you've pulled your fabric tight enough. Back to the wrong side of the garment. I'm going to take what's left of the welt and fold that fabric down on itself. Now this is where we can kind of position the 2 lips of our welt pocket. I've still got the fabric folded, and I want to make sure that the amount of fabric I see of my welt is about 1/4 inch, being that is the half the width of the rectangle I removed. So I want to fold this fabric on the back enough so that the amount of fabric you see from this bottom welt measures about 1/4 inch from where it intersects the muslin to the top edge of the fold. So I want that to be 1/4 inch. And I want a nice straight fold. I don't want my welt folding crooked. Whoops. I don't want it going crooked like this or like this. Keep a nice straight line along the top of that fold, and I'm going to press that into place once I'm satisfied with the position of my welt. So that's one welt done. I'm going to take care of this top welt so you can see it one more time. This is the front of my sample. It's the front of my garment. I'm going to take this welt and shove it through that hole that we cut into the muslin. Push all this fabric to the inside or the wrong side of the garment. So everything's going to be on the inside. Let me flip this around to the wrong side of the sample. Okay. So there's my top welt. This piece right here is my top welt. This is my bottom welt hanging out down here. I want all of my seam allowance to push away. I want to be able to see my welt as a rectangle on this side. So again, I'm going to grab my tailor's point, get the nice flat edge of the tailor's point, place my fabric on there. There's my welt fabric, and I want to hold this tight. I'm actually holding it tight between my fingers and press that excess away from my welt fabric. All right, now my welt's on the inside. I'm going to grab the loose bit of that welt and fold that. So that the lips of my two welts meet in the middle. So here's my bottom welt. It was flat, we folded it down. Here's my top welt, we folded this up. And I want these two lips to meet in the middle. I'm going to check this from the right side to make sure that I don't have too much of a gap between those two folded welts. And when I'm satisfied with where my fold is, I will press this yet again. There's a little bit of a gap on there, but I'm okay with that. If you see actual welt pockets on garments, these two welts are usually stitched together so that you don't have them gaping apart. So they stay nice and flat. Now, we've still got these two triangles, these two ugly bits hanging out on the front of our garment. I'm going to tuck those underneath, just shove them back inside of the garment. I'm using my awl to kind of push everything back and out of the way. So you're just folding those underneath so that they get out of the way. Same thing here. Just fold it back underneath itself so that we have that nice rectangle that we started with on our pattern. And press it again. That'll set your welts. That'll set all the little triangles out of the way. And we have the start to our double welt or bound pocket. The next thing I want to do is make sure this doesn't all fall apart as I put my pocket bag into place. So let's head back to the production table so we can see where we're getting ready to sew. All right, so we've got our welt pressed into place. Now we need to kind of lock it down so it's secure when we go to place our pocket bag. From the right side of your sample, remember that's the right side, this is the wrong side. Right side of your sample, we want to pull the garment fabric, so just this single layer of muslin, we just want to push this up and out of the way. You should see your little triangle here. If it is stuck to the muslin, peel it back. It's probably stuck from the interfacing. Peel it back so that we have the two remaining edges of the welts and that little triangle sticking over there. We're gonna stitch over this. It doesn't have to be super pretty, doesn't have to be amazing. We just need to make sure it's secure. Same thing on the opposite side, lifting just the first layer of muslin garment fabric. Make sure that triangle stays flat so that we can stitch that triangle to these two other welts here. Same thing on the top edge. You would lift the muslin fabric away, and again, if this seam allowance is kind of stuck, just peel it away so that you can just lift the muslin fabric. You'll see what remains of the muslin fabric seam allowance from the rectangle we chopped open, and you'll see what remains of the seam allowance for the top welt. We're going to stitch these two together so that those stay secure and that this top welt fabric doesn't fly away on us. Same thing on the bottom edge, lifting just the garment fabric, making sure we have the remaining garment seam allowance and the remaining seam allowance from the bottom welt. We're going to stitch that together. So I'm going to head to my machine and stitch these 4 sides. I will not sew them all the way around. I'm going to do one side, then the other side, then the top edge, and then the bottom edge, back tacking on all of them. Back at my machine, I can now switch back to a number 2 stitch. I don't need super secure stitches because I'm not working on any corners. Lifting up my garment fabric, making sure that triangle stays down. I'm going to stitch as close as I can to the widest point, widest edge of this triangle without stitching over it. We don't want to catch the folds of the muslin or else we won't be able to push this fabric back into place. I'm just going to get as close to that wide edge of the triangle as I can. And back tack. Make sure that take-up lever is up, lift the presser foot, remove my work, trim my threads. So that is secured in place. And I can let my fabric back down. I'm going to do the same over here. So that triangle to that leftover fabric on my welts. Whoops. When you're sewing these, make sure everything stays as flat as possible. We don't want the welts to splay out. Try and keep them nice and flat and hold them together. If you need to base stitch anything into place, you are welcome to do so to secure everything so it doesn't fly away from you while you're sewing. So that is secure. Again, try and keep my welts together. I'll do the top edge, just lifting the garment fabric, stitching these 2 together. Back tack at the beginning. Back tack at the end. Make sure my take-up lever is up. Lift my presser foot, remove my work, trim my threads. Notice that I stitch as close as I can to the original number 1 stitches, just to make sure I catch my extra fabric in there. And we can lift that up out of the way. Same thing here. Just going to lift the bottom garment fabric, and again, stitch as close as I can without going over the original stitches. Back tack at the beginning, back tack at the end. Make sure my take-up lever is up, lift my presser foot, remove my work, trim my threads. All right. So that should be all 4 edges locked down. Now we can work on the pocket bag. Our welt pocket's in place. This is not going to go anywhere. It's not going to shift on us. It should be fine. If there's any bits of your folded welt that didn't get caught, it's okay. We can always kind of hand stitch it in there, but again, this is just a sample. As long as it looks pretty from the outside, we should be good to go. Last pattern that we're going to use, this welt/bound pocket bag pattern. We're going to place this in such a way so that when we stick our hand into this pocket, there's actually something to put our hands into. Turn your sample to the wrong side, so the inside of your garment. Take your pocket bag, place that right side down. So one of the short edges, line up the raw edge of one of the short edges to your seam allowance. Remember, there's this little bit of 1/4 inch seam allowance up here at the top. Align this to your seam allowance up here. So raw edges flush, and we're going to stitch this all together. I'm going to pinch everything and isolate the seam allowance and the top edge of my pocket bag. Pin it just to make sure it doesn't go anywhere. Now to ensure that I stitch in the correct place, I'm going to be stitching from this side, similar to where we locked down our seam allowances, that line of number 2 stitches, which are sitting over here to the right of my original stitching. I'm just going to stitch over that one more time, and I'm going to catch all of the seam allowances, including the pocket bag, all at once. I'll be right back once I get that sewn. All right, so here's my pocket bag. It's sewn into place. I stitched over that same line of stitching that I just placed to secure my welt pocket. You can stitch further to the edge, it doesn't really matter. Whatever you need to do just to make sure that pocket bag stays secure to these seam allowances, and that you don't stitch over the original line of number 1 stitches and you don't catch these little folds, you're fine. We just need to make sure that the pocket bag stays secure. So again, here's the front of my sample. Here's the back. If I lift this up, you can see there's all the welts in there. My pocket bag is now positioned. This is a tricky part. We've secured the top of our pocket bag. Now we need to secure the bottom. So I'm going to grab the bottom edge of the pocket bag, push all my excess fabric up and out of the way. Now I want to match this short edge to my seam allowances on the bottom edge of my welt pocket. Make sure that's nice and flush. Keep your sides of the pocket bag as square as possible. Avoid tilting it like this or shifting it to the side. Try and keep everything nice and squared up. It's not going to be perfect, but get as close as you can. I'm going to isolate the seam allowance and the bottom edge of the pocket bag, pin it in place. And just as we did before, just going to stitch along, making sure I catch the seam allowances and that bottom edge of that pocket bag all at once. Make sure that I don't stitch over that number 1 line of stitching that I made first, and make sure I don't catch these little pieces of muslin. I say that. Okay. There's the top of my pocket bag, stitched to the top edge of my seam allowances. Flip all that extra fabric out of the way. There's the bottom edge of my pocket bag, stitched to the bottom edge of my seam allowances. And now from the right side, once we open this, we don't just have a gaping hole, we actually have some fabric back there. We've got a little space we can put our hand into, but we got holes on the side, so we need to secure those. I want to lay my pocket bag nice and flat. I'm reaching underneath and I'm pulling, just like pushing the bottom fold of the pocket bag down. And I'm smoothing the pocket bag down just to make sure that everything's lying nice and flat. I'm going to give this a real quick press so that I can press this bottom fold. Make sure you tug on it. Otherwise, you're going to end up with too much fabric gathering and bunching up in here. So give it a good tug. Give it a good finger press. You know, lay your hand on there, give it some pressure. And now I'm going to take this over to the iron and press everything nice and flat. All right. Got a nice flat fold pressed into my pocket bag. Just as I did before when securing these little triangles, I'm going to lift up my garment fabric. I want that triangle to lay down. And just as we did before where we were stitching over those original lines of stitching, I'm going to stitch again along this side, catching the top of my 2 welts at the top, catching the triangle and stitching about a ½ inch away from the raw edge of my pocket bag. So I'm going to secure right along the edge here. Doesn't have to be perfect, doesn't have to be straight, doesn't have to be pretty. We just want to make sure we stitch together the holes on the sides of our pocket bags. Number 2 stitch, back tack at the beginning, back tack at the end. Now that I'm past the welt, I can just get all my muslin fabric out of the way. Be careful when back tacking at the fold here. Get as close as you can to the fold. And back tack over that. Make sure the take-up lever is up. Lift your presser foot. Remove the work. Trim the threads. So that's nice and secure, and I can fold my garment fabric back. Do the same thing over here. I've got no seam guide on this side to make sure I'm stitching at a 1/2 inch, so I'm just using the edge of my presser foot to line up with the raw edge of the pocket bag. Make sure I'm stitching straight. Take up lever all the way up, lift the presser foot, remove the work, clip your threads. So now I've got both sides of the pocket bag secure. It's a lot of steps, but it makes for a very interesting looking pocket. Sides are secure. There's no real indication of what's going on with the welts underneath. The pocket bag now covers all of that. This, of course, sits on the inside of the garment. And when you peek inside, everything's nice and clean finished, no raw edges. We've got an actual bag we can stick our hand into, no holes or anything on the inside. That is the welt or bound pocket sample.